So a lot of people, they have recency bias when they think of inflation. Almost everybody thinks about the 1970s. It's basically, it's like, okay, how do you get inflation down? You become Paul Volcker and you raise interest rates, and that's kind of the axiom that people operate with inflation. But when we look back in history over more countries, more sample size in terms of length, we see that there's actually multiple different types of inflation. There's different causes of inflation, and I think we can kind of put that into three categories. The one category that's present in all the different ones is that there's some degree of supply constraint. We don't have infinite resources. So if you had infinite resources, like let's say our entire economy consists of software, you might not get corresponding price increases with increasing the money supply. So generally what you see in times of inflation is that you run into some real world constraint. In the 70s, for example, U.S. oil production peaked in 1970 after almost like a century of just almost every year's up, structurally up. And so we became more reliant on imports, which made us more geopolitically exposed. And so that was a constraint that then made so that larger than normal money supply growth does have pretty tangible consequences. So that's always a factor, and it takes different forms. But then the other two factors are the other side of the equation, which is generally an expansion of the money supply. And then the question is, where's that expansion of the money supply coming from? And there's really two main ways that money supply in the modern economy happens. And the one that most people think of is bank lending. So as banks, as velocity increases, as loan creation increases, we get more and more IOUs, basically deposits, chasing a similar amount of goods and services, and so you get inflation. That was in the 1970s. That was the primary driver of money supply growth, loan creation, because you had the baby boomer generation, which is born starting in the late 40s, early 50s. They were turning 25, 30 throughout the 70s and then into the 80s, where they were entering their home buying years, which is when people start making use of credit. So due to demographics reason, we had like higher than normal rates of loan creation, so fast money supply growth. And then you added on, I mean, you had significant fiscal deficits. They weren't huge, but they were there. And then you also had the oil problem, so you had a big toxic recipe for inflation. Whereas you look in other periods, the other driver of money supply growth ends up dominating, which is fiscal deficit. So if you have large fiscal deficits, especially if they're monetized by the central bank, then it doesn't really matter if banks are lending or not. Money's just being handed out. It could be handed out in stimulus checks. It could be handed out in soldier salaries. It could be handed out in stimulus to build new manufacturing plants, whatever the case may be. It's going out into the economy. And it's being created from new reserve creation. And so when you get those large fiscal deficits, that's it's a similar end result as money creation, except the causes are different. And that's what we saw in the 1940s, and that's what we saw here in the 2020s so far, which is that the inflation in those eras was not because banks were lending at a higher than normal rate. It was because the government was running larger than normal deficits to respond to what they perceive as a crisis. And so the challenge there is that the tool of raising rates is primarily effective at trying to slow bank lending. It makes it less attractive for people to borrow money, and therefore can potentially suppress that excessive rate of money growth. But if large government deficits are what's driving inflation primarily, then higher rates don't really tackle that, because governments are relatively rate insensitive. They don't usually say, oh, well, now because bond yields are 5%, we're going to get together and we're going to trim the military budget. It doesn't really happen. And so in practice, you have a rate insensitive source of money creation. And the best that higher rates can do is offset that. So you could suppress the private sector enough that you get inflation down temporarily, but you're not actually addressing the core problem. It's like one kid ate too much, so the other kid, you have to give them half the food so that your average food per child is the same, right? It doesn't really, you're not actually addressing the problem, which is the one kid ate the other kid's food. And so that's kind of the approach that they're doing, because the Fed doesn't really have other tools. It's mostly a fiscal problem, and central banks aren't really in the political position to say, well, it's not our problem. Maybe they should, but that's kind of where we find ourselves in, which is that this is mostly a fiscal-driven inflation, and the tools that address it are mostly fiscal, not monetary. One thing I think that he could be criticized for is that during the pandemic, he called for more fiscal, right? So early on in 2020, basically when they were already doing their monetary, they dropped rates to zero. They were doing QE and swap lines and all this stuff. And he said, really what we need is fiscal. It was a rare case of a central banker getting somewhat political and saying, this is a tool we need right now. That's not ours. It's out of our hands. Whereas you're not seeing similar directives now, where he says what we need is less fiscal, right? He's basically saying that he'll dance around it and say, yes, the fiscal situation is unstable, but that's not our purview. Like, he's not actually calling for anything. Yeah. And he could call for less fiscal. And the challenge, and a lot of us in this space, like the digital asset space and also in adjacent spaces like the gold space, part of why we're in this space is because we think the current system is unsustainable. If we thought it was sustainable, we might not be in these spaces. We might be in the existing space. And one of the challenges that makes this environment, say, different than the 70s, going back to the fiscal versus lending concept. So in the 70s, the federal government had 30% debt to GDP. And like I said, most of the money creation was happening from bank lending. So when they raised rates, it would increase the interest expense from the government, which is in some ways stimulative. Ironically, it's pouring money into the economy. But that was a much smaller impact than it would have dampening that loan creation. Right, so it wasn't an effective inflating fighting tool. The problem in, say, the 40s or the 2020s is that if you have over 100% debt to GDP and your deficits are what's primarily causing inflation, then raising rates actually increases your deficit, and it increases the deficit at a higher rate than the impact is likely to have on loan reduction in the private sector, because you're expanding a bigger thing faster than you're reducing the smaller thing, which is loan creation. So you get this kind of period where it seems like it's working at first because you're putting pressure on the private sector, you're slowing things down, but then you're building this structural new source of money creation, which is all of these larger and larger deficits pouring into the economy. And so I just think it's a very challenging political position because we don't really have the bipartisanship to address the budget directly, and then the central bank doesn't really have the tools to address it, but they have to act like they're doing something. They don't really have the purview to say this is not our issue, so they have to kind of act, even if the act itself is not actually attacking the direct problem.
Small ebook, big impact, the wealth tree, the only 4 ways that will make you financially free forever. Download it here for free.